1, 2, 3, 4, test. Un, deux.
Thank you, Céline. So, good morning, everyone. Good morning to our speakers. Good morning to good afternoon. Sorry, I haven't had lunch yet. So, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to the organizer of this conference, to the participants online, and to the participants in this amphitheater. My name is Caroline Roussel. I'm the Dean of IÉSEG School of Management, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you. I'm looking forward to the conference with this interesting topic, and I think that the topics that we address over these 2 days of workshop are really, really hot topic and a super important topic at the moment related to decision-making processes and uncertainty in every areas related to risk, environmental, health, economic, and social risk, for example. This conference is part of a cycle of conferences that we have at IÉSEG, which are called Inspiring Conferences. And basically, in terms of decision-making process at IÉSEG, we have implemented almost 10 years ago now a specific decision-making process, which is called a deep visioning process. And when we have reflected on the strategy of the school, we have decided to have a collective intelligence exercise, and we have embarked all the staff of the school. So at this time, 10 years ago, almost 400 people. We have embarked the students, the alumni, also the partners of the school, also the political contact, political power, public power, who are working in higher education. And basically, we have started to reflect on the roots of the school, on the DNA, on the strengths, on the weaknesses, the opportunities, and so on and so forth. And we have also traveled a lot over the world. We have experienced, we have organized learning experiences to try to identify the trends in society, the trends in higher education. And we have started to implement this cycle of inspiring conferences in order to open our mind to what is happening in the world, what is moving, and to integrate all these changes, all these evolutions in our decision-making process. So it's the way we have built the vision of the school, which is to be a unique international hub empowering changemakers for a better society, which is the ambition of the school, the collective ambition for 2025, and we are on our way to implement it. And iRisk Research Center is part of this ambition. So the school has the ambition to develop its research and also to address relevant topics which have an impact, societal impact, and which could make the difference in terms of the education that we provide to future managers. So I'm really pleased to welcome you for this conference and enjoy the talk.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to this inspiring conference about decision-making under uncertainty in practice. So to discuss this topic, I'm very pleased to welcome a panel of leading experts in policymaking and from the academic community. And the purpose will be to promote this dialogue between theory and practice. So my name is Thibault Lurad. I'm the business editor for the media The Conversation. For those who don't know The Conversation, it's a very special media where authors from the academic world give their take on the news based on the research. So our purpose is also to promote this dialogue between theory and practice. Before introducing you to our speakers, I just wanted to add that this conference is broadcasted on YouTube, and there will be a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to ask your question through the chat, and we'll ask them to our panels during the Q&A session. So now to discuss the topic of decision-making in uncertainty, let's first welcome Vicky Pollard, Deputy Head of Unit Foresight, Economic Analysis and Modeling at the DG Climate Action at the European Commission since September 2019. More generally, Vicky, you have been working on climate change for the Commission since 2004, covering, amongst others, international negotiations. And you have also worked on the EU Lisbon strategy, on the review of the EU Sustainable Development Strategy, right? All of that is correct. Then we will have Christian Gaulier, Professor of Economics at the Toulouse School of Economics, an internationally renowned researcher in decision theory under uncertainty and its application in climate economics, finance and cost-benefit analysis. You are also, Christian, one of the authors of the 4th and 5th report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And you also published Le Climat après la fin du mois in 2019, which was a great success in France. Then sitting next to you, we have Matthias Devatripont. You are an economic theorist, professor of economics at the Solvay Brussels School of the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And noticeably, during those last 2 years, you were a member of expert groups monitoring the evolution of the COVID-19 crisis in Belgium. You were working for the Belgian government strategy. And previously, you were also executive director of the National Bank of Belgium between 2011 and 2017, being its representative on the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision and on the supervisory board of the European Central Bank. And finally, we have Gilles Moek. You are the AXA Group Chief Economist and AXA IM Head of Research since June 2019. And previously, you have also worked as an economist at Bank America, Merrill Lynch, and Deutsche Bank. And you held several positions at the French National Statistical Institute, l'INSEE, and at the Banque de France. Welcome to all of you. So to kick off the discussion, I'd like to turn to Vicky Pollard, because lots have happened over the last weeks at the European Commission with this text about the end of thermal motors by 2035. and also this discussion about a green taxonomy that took place this week. So can you tell us more about what happened over there during the last weeks, and what elements of uncertainty did you took under account?
Okay, does this work? Yes. Okay, thanks. So to put a bit of context, so the last week.
You should.
The last.
Yeah.
The last weeks are a midpoint in the co-decision on a big package of legislation. The Fit for 55 package is its unofficial term, because it's been renamed with a more official term in between. This is something which comes as part of the implementation of the European Green Deal. Under the European Green Deal, we have a climate neutrality target. We need to get to climate neutrality by 2050. That means balancing emissions with removals. Those emissions that we can't reduce down to zero, because we need to take every effort before then to get that the mitigation down as close to zero as possible. So that climate target, we have an interim target of 2030 of minus 55%, and the package of legislation on which we had a general approach from the French presidency at the end of June, but also the votes on the reports from Parliament also at the end of June, is a package of 13 pieces of legislation, a mixture of pricing, regulation with targets, but also standards. And amongst that, you have the ones you have mentioned. So for the cars, basically getting to zero CO2 emissions by 2035. But there's also the revision of the EU ETS. The EU ETS is we've always referred to it as a key piece of legislation, the cornerstone, because it covers our largest emitters, but also because what it does is provide an element of certainty with a declining cap over time, which goes down to zero for those emitters, and it allows the market to set a price for carbon, which is a very important signal. And there are other measures alongside that, the targets for member states, for everything outside the ETS. Because we're very important to get that general approach from the Council at the end of the French presidency, because it allows, we know what the positions are now of the member states, but also of the European Parliament, going into the detailed discussions, the trilogues. I would say that we have a position on both sides which is much closer than we thought it would be. We've have a lot more agreement than we would have expected, say, a year ago when the proposals came out. It's also a process which has gone very fast. It's a sign of the political will to get things moving. I think it's helped by the current situation. We didn't expect to be in a situation we are in now with the war and the uncertainty on energy markets and all those implications. Then for the member state targets, it's pretty certain. For the cars, I think there's agreement on the overall target. Where there are still disagreements or differences in position is around the detail. For example, the exemption for small volume manufacturers, so those companies that can't spread the obligation over time to reduce over a larger volume of cars. And maybe also to explain, because I don't know how much people know the full package, but we also, under the ETS, so we have an EU ETS which has been in place since 2005, and to extend carbon pricing to other sectors to increase the incentive for action, there is a proposal for a new emissions trading system for buildings and transport, and that is also part of the co-decision. And there, the position of the Parliament and the Council, there's agreement that something should go ahead, but there's more uncertainty about how. So whether it would be a more restricted version, but also what happens to the revenues, because we have these policies create certainty in terms of emission reduction pathways, but they also create important revenues. And the use of those revenues is very important for the transition in terms of investment in new technologies and new ways of, under the buildings and transport ETS. So for support for those who are more vulnerable, so households who are more vulnerable, SMEs who are more vulnerable, the support that will allow, for example, for large-scale insulation of houses, so that the carbon price can act, but at the same time we don't put people under pressure, especially those people who have the least capacity to take the measures to reduce their exposure to the price.
Well, thank you. Christian Gaulier, you have been taking lots of notes during during Vicky's presentation. How do you react to what she just said?
You didn't. Yeah, thank you. I mean, let me first say I'm extremely impressive. I'm very impressed by the quality of the proposals of the Commission. This Fit for 55 package is incredible. I mean, it's politically courageous, something that most governments in Europe have not been able to explain and say and propose. That is proposed by the Commission. It's very impressive, and we currently see, and we have seen that in May and June in the EU Parliament, the lack of will of the elected people to support actions that could be disliked by the electors in Europe. I mean, clearly, the objective of 55% reduction of CO2 emissions by the year 2030 is an incredible challenge. It has been politically decided 5 years ago. But although we have this incredible challenge, the actions, I mean, we know action will trigger sacrifices for the people, and the people don't want that, and the politicians don't want to appear as following things that could impose some sacrifice of the people. So we live in the utopia of a happy energy transition. It's an utopia, and we really face a political issue associated to that. And the Commission tried to put some of its political will in the process. And again, it's very impressive, and we should support that. First thing. Second thing, climate change is the best playground for decision theorists. You know, this is something where risk and uncertainty are everywhere. I mean, it's not one of the dimensions. It's the big dimension of the problem. What should we do in the face of this enormous uncertainty, not only on the intensity of climate change, on the climate sensitivity, but also on the technology. I mean, having the will to go to net zero by the year 2050 without knowing, and nobody has the least idea about what will be, how the European economy will look like, fully decarbonized in 28 years from now. Nobody knows whether it will be capture and sequestration, how we will solve the problem of intermittency of solar and wind energy. There is such huge uncertainty around that. So it's perfect. I try to convince my dear colleagues in decision theory and the uncertainty to have a look at that. It's so fun. It's so fun, and the social demand for that is so big that I spend most of my time now talking to the media rather than writing paper. That's not necessarily good for my career, but that's the situation. So please help me. Let me take so it's the political situation is very interesting, because we face all those uncertainty, and at the same time the politicians want to provide the clear vision and clear objective with no uncertainty. You mentioned that several times, and I think it's good. It's in a sense providing a vision, providing a road and a target in this uncertain world, it's good. People like that, it's important to tell them what we want to go. How we go there, it's another question, but at least providing the target is good. Let me just give an example. This decision seems now an agreement with between the Commission and the Parliament, so that's okay. So prohibition of new internal engine by the year 2035 in Europe. That's clear. Everybody understand. We will not be able to purchase a new car with internal combustion in 13 years from now. It's tomorrow. Huh? But what will be the price of those electric cars that will replace those internal combustion engine? Nobody knows. What will be the price of gasoline at the pump at that time? Nobody knows. It may be possible, remember, that if we are really serious about fighting climate change at the level of the planet, meaning that we will stop purchasing oil and natural gas from the oil-rich countries, if we are credible on that, Saudi Arabia, Russia will start to understand that if they do not sell quickly their reserve, they will lose most of their wealth. So they will start trying to sell that before it's too late. Therefore, the price will go down. So we may get gasoline price at maybe €1 per liter in 15 years from now. What will be the attitude of the consumer when they will be forced to purchase electric car at the time where gasoline at the pump is €1 per liter? So there is here a lot of issue. It seems that we have, so this is, everybody seems to agree that we should prohibit selling new internal engine car by the year 2035, but in reality, nobody knows whether it will be politically acceptable in 13 years from now, and there will be likely to be renegotiation at that time. Same thing for zero net emission by the year 2050. Maybe it will be so costly for the consumer that there will be a revolution against that, and we will have to revise that. But again, it's good for politicians to at least mention that the target is there. But we should also recognize that maybe there is some risk, but it's a Pandora box. If we start to say, maybe there are contingency where we will not be able to get there, then there is doubt, introduce doubt in the public opinion, and you don't know where it goes. At the same time, it's risky. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Matthias de Vetripoint. It's going to be, we could obviously continue this discussion about the climate change crisis, but it would be nice to hear you about another crisis, about the COVID-19 crisis. So as a reminder, you were part of a group of experts who have worked during the crisis for the Belgian government. So what are the issues you had no answer to when a decision was necessary, and what lessons do you bring do you get through this period, from this period?
Well, from the point of uncertainty, I think, and in a sense, I'm building upon what Christian said. People don't like uncertainty. They want perspectives. They want, and ideally, they want rosy perspectives, and which, of course, then builds on the short-termism, the fact that yes, we like to think that this crisis is over, and so on. So I do think that one of the, indeed, one of the challenges of experts and politicians is to make people understand that indeed at times the future will be uncertain. The fact that that the virus is evolving, that the new variants may appear, that at the beginning we thought that if your distance is 1.5 meters, you don't need a mask. But then, boom, at the 3 months later, we realize it's aerosols that are important, and so you have to revise things. So then of course people start being, a bit worried and conspirationist and so on. So these kinds of things are quite worrisome. On the other hand, there are a bunch of things that are reasonably robust. Because everybody wants to go towards smart lockdowns rather than full lockdown. Of course, you could do it once, the full lockdown in March 2020, because there was a crisis. Everybody was so worried, so they accepted everything. Of course, then they thought, okay, it's the summer, it's over, and then boom, come back the the fall, and then they are not ready to accept everything. So you have to start explaining that you are indeed going towards a smarter lockdown, and indeed it's cost and benefits in terms of, inside is more dangerous than outside, and lots of people in a room is more dangerous than few people, no ventilation and so on. But the problem is then you start having people who are losers and people who are winners, and then all the political economics is coming. And of course, nobody wants to be the loser, especially if they are just next to the person who's just above the bar. And I remember one of the first reports we had to do after in our second group at the end of 2020. The government asked the question, okay, can you tell us why shops can be open but hairdressers cannot be? And then immediately some guy said, show me a study explaining how dangerous hairdressers are. Then we said, there are things where you can do randomized control experiments, like for vaccines, and even there, this was not always easy. But you will not start spreading the virus in a hairdresser or not, and so on. So you need to think about different types of evidence. And so, of course, it takes a while to educate people, but I think overall it can work, even though a big problem in terms of distribution is what economists call the prisoner's dilemma. Of course, you want, you're not against your competitors being closed or other sectors being closed, but you want to be open because then you can take advantage of that. Now, if everybody is doing that game, then of course we end up with too many things open, and their economists have been very important, I think, since I think, for example, there is a famous paper by Raj Chetty in Harvard and a big set of people showing that this trade-off that everybody's talking about, health versus the economy, is not a proper trade-off. Closing the economy is an investment to reduce the virus, and then people restart their economic activity. Because if the virus is there, then, of course, it will demand that will go down. Even if supply is there, it won't work. Now, interestingly, this kind of idea, which is very robust, is hard to get through in the media, because in the media, it's all the people who are losing that are making noise. Those who are open and so on, they just, okay, they got what they wanted, so they don't. But I think the fact that then you have to say, look, okay, you just make sure that you give financial compensation for those who are closed, so that then they start shutting up, and it's okay. But I think these kinds of things are always complicated, because next to the uncertainty and the fact that the variants became more and more contagious, there is this thing about the distributional impact, and that I think is. And of course, I'm coming from a country of coalition government, so there are always, those who'd like to play the good guys. I'm in favor of hairdressers, and everybody needs a hairdresser almost. So I think that's a tough sector to close. But then indeed they are very happy to let the Minister of Health be the bad guys, and they will play the good guys just for pure pandering reasons. That's one of the difficulties of democracy. I'm not saying that democracy is a bad system. It's as people say, it's the worst system except all the others. So, but indeed, these are things that are difficult for governments and therefore for experts.
You also wrote an article in Le Monde just days ago about the vaccine strategy, in which you say it could have been much better, finally, in France at least.
Well, I would qualify this, and not just because we are in France here. So, I mean, in this article, indeed, which appeared recently, well, first of all, I discussed two different things: vaccine development and then vaccination strategies. On vaccine development, I think everybody agrees that it has been quite a success, getting such good vaccines so fast. And I point to the fact, and I'm not the only one, to say that the US was extremely impressive on that front. Of course, the Trump administration did lots of bad things about the crisis, but their Operation Warp Speed and their reliance on the BARDA, Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, they really did a good example of industrial policy. And industrial policy is often, I know it's popular in this country, but at times people say, ha ha ha, picking winners, can the government do that? Well, I think the way it was done here, and indeed BARDA really concentrated funding on 6 firms, or 6 pairs of firms, 3 technologies times 2 firms, so the famous mRNA technology, but also viral vector and then recombinant protein. And so 2 firms each, so Moderna and BioNTech, Pfizer for the first one, and then AstraZeneca, Oxford, and Johnson & Johnson for the second, and so on. 5 out of the 6 were successful in record time. By the way, the only one that hasn't yet been a success is the one by 2 of the 4 biggest firms in vaccine pre-COVID, Sanofi and GSK, that did that together. But I think that was really a very smart strategy in terms of industrial policy by diversification and also dual sourcing, so that you don't have only one firm. And they funded firms that were, well, half of them were not US firms, so they went global and so on. So I think that is a smart thing to do. And I do think that now with the new geopolitics and so on, I think industrial policy is in fashion again. And I think it's not a bad idea, but it has to be done well and combined with sufficient competition and so on. So I think this is an example that is worth looking at. Now on vaccination, because as people say, vaccines don't save lives, vaccination does. You still need to put the vaccine in the arm of people. I think there was again choice under uncertainty, because we knew, well, we had good evidence that the vaccines were efficient and reasonably safe, but you never know at the beginning. And so how do you convince people to get vaccinated? So there were 2 things that were done, one good and one less good. And by the way, France overall did very well in the management of the COVID strategy, I think. Even though at the beginning they weren't prepared, like many countries. But when you look at excess mortality statistics these days, I mean, France is really good. But like every country, okay, one problem was, at the beginning, we don't have vaccines for everybody, so you have to choose what to do. And I think the strategy there to go for fragile people and volunteers, I think was a good idea, because you don't want to force people early on, because there may be risks and so on. And then once it started, people start realizing that indeed the vaccines were not had few adverse effects, and then you could see overall that the number of people against vaccine went down quite a lot. So that's the good news. The bad news is that most countries, including France and Belgium, started saying, look, vaccination will be a free choice. And then saying, and moreover, we will reach herd immunity. Now, they had not realized that it could be inconsistent. And in fact, it was inconsistent. Because herd immunity at the beginning was seen, and it all depends on the contagiousness, was seen as around 70% of the population. But then came the Alpha variant, the Delta variant, and of course now the Omicron variant. And so even with Delta, it went up to 90%. And 90%, well, we couldn't be there just by keeping it free choice. And then, of course, various governments had to start incentivize vaccination, and the Corona Pass is a good example. And of course, a number of people felt betrayed. You had promised this would be a free choice, and now I cannot go to a movie without either having had it or being vaccinated or being tested, and now the test is becoming expensive and all these kind of things. And I think it would have been smarter to say, look, we will start with fragile and volunteers, and then we'll see what happens. This idea that it will be a free choice, at the end of a year where so many freedoms had been suspended, I mean, it's amazing what had been happening, and all of a sudden vaccination should be a free choice. That was a bit stupid. But on the other hand, I guess the view was we won't have this inconsistency. So they underestimated the uncertainty and the ability of the virus to become more contagious and these kind of things. And of course, today with Omicron, I think the whole vaccination momentum has stopped because, well, it's less severe and is very, very contagious. So vaccination does not prevent contagion. And so, but we will have to see what happens in the fall in particular, or even today. So you have, I don't know how many people here have the virus, but I do think that when you look at a country like Portugal, which is very well vaccinated, but had a BA5 wave recently, they had quite some thank you. they had quite some deaths. So we'll have to, and the problem is that basically we all want this to be over. It's interesting. I was in a conference talking about the history of pandemics and the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu killed possibly more people than the first two world wars together. And but then it was stopped. It was declared over when basically governments and the population were fed up with it. And somebody told me that, you know, you go to France, every village, they have, you know, the number of deaths in World War I, in World War II. So fewer in World War II than in World War I because, okay. But there is only one little town in France where there is remembrance of the Spanish flu, and I think it's true in Belgium too. So it's a bit funny, but I think this is something we want to forget, and this may come back with a vengeance. And so that's again a failure to properly understand uncertainty, I think. Anyway, I don't want to be pessimistic, but
especially we have to share the microphone amongst the speakers also. So I hope this will not be a problem. Gilles Moeg, so you're an economist. You're in charge of forecasting. Would you say that the current years, in the current years, your job has never been so difficult? There has been lots of mistakes made by in forecasting. We didn't realize that the rebound of the growth would be so quick. We didn't realize that inflation would be back so strongly and it would last over time. So what do you think? What have you learned about the last crisis?
Well, we've had easier times, I would say, in our line of work. But I would maybe start with what might be a paradoxical point, which is that, in a way, the developed economies at least managed to minimize uncertainty in an incredible manner at the very beginning of the pandemic from a financial and economic point of view. I think this is a bit lost in the debate now, but you know, on the financial markets at least, you could think of two possible reactions to massive uncertainty, such as the one we had in March 2020, when really, you know, the pandemic became obvious to everyone. Reaction number one, I don't know what's going to happen, so I'm not going to move. I'm not going to change anything. I'm not going to sell anything. I'm not going to buy anything. I'm just going to keep my asset allocation unchanged. That would probably be the rational reaction, actually. Reaction 2, I'm scared, I'm going to sell everything that is remotely risky. And guess what? This is what happened in March. The only thing that saved us is the absolute belief in the market, in the fact that central banks would save our bacon. And central banks did save our bacon in March 2020. And I want to remind the audience of that because it did not come by chance. And we arrived to this reaction from the central banks after many years of trial and errors in how to deal with financial crisis. So first, in this ocean of uncertainty, there was a beacon of stability, at least in my line of work. Central banks will do the job. And second, we had another beacon of stability, which is that it's amazing when you think of it in hindsight. There was very, very little debate in the economic community at the time of the pandemic on whether or not we would have to engage in massive fiscal support. It was obvious to everyone. Well, for people of my generation who were schooled in the late 80s, early 90s, it was not obvious at all. I was schooled in the failure of Keynesian economics in the 1970s. There was absolutely no internal debate. This reaction from governments was massive, and that actually reduced the quantum of macro uncertainty in the system to a very, very large extent to start with. Now, on how we operate, I think we have to deal with two different kinds of uncertainty, two different sources of uncertainty in the current environment. One is, I would call it, empirical uncertainty. On COVID, as Matthias said, we didn't know what was going to happen. And the worst thing that economists can do is turn themselves into epidemiologists. And very, very often we had to say and tell our clients, our stakeholders, sorry, but I don't know. There is no possible answer to your question. It was a major issue at the peak of the pandemic in the West. It is still an issue. A lot of what's going on right now in the business cycle is a legacy of the pandemic. The fact that we had a synchronized reopening across the world is triggering a lot of the current inflation spike, and we're still very dependent on whether or not China, for instance, is going to go through another flare-up in the next few months, because this would have another impact on global supply. So, empirical uncertainty. And the other one, I think, is a creeping theoretical uncertainty. What I described about the situation in 2020 was this sort of massive consensus. We know what central banks were going to do, and we knew what governments would do. Today, we don't know. Or at least there's a debate. Clearly, central banks are less happy to maintain accommodative monetary policy. We don't know how far they're willing to go to kill inflation. And as governments are concerned, their room for maneuver is falling precisely because monetary policy is tightening. So we cannot be sure of what the fiscal stance is going to be in the next year or so. So, conclusion, what do we do? Because my job is to produce forecasts, right? In a way, I'm super happy because people no longer care that much about the baseline scenario. When I started my career, you could be crucified because you had missed a change in consumer spending by 0.3% over a year. How did you, this forecast mistake is just horrible. Because at the time, well, GDP would move between 1.5 and 2.5, so 0.3 was a big issue. And the focus was really on this idea that we could predict the future. We could actually come up with a baseline that made sense. Today, the focus is, I think, fortunately, about scenarios. And I think what our job, at least my job as a private sector forecaster is to provide clients, decision makers, I think it's the same in the public sector with policymakers, a set of reasonable, internally consistent scenarios. That's what we do. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if Russia tomorrow is going to turn the tap off. But we can at least present a set of logical, sequenced consequences of a number of events happening, which will make the reaction time of policymakers or investors faster. That's what we can do. We cannot predict what's going to happen, but if A, B, and C happens, this is what we think should be the logical consequences and how we can prepare for it. It's more humble than saying that you can predict the future. I'm not Nouriel Roubini, but I think it's actually more interesting in terms of the debate you can have as an economist with your stakeholders. Stop here.
Okay. Vicky, how do you react to what has just said? In policymaking, you need these scenarios, you rely on them.
So yes, I mean, there was a discussion about the uncertainty about the transition. I think we're very certain about the impacts of that climate change will happen, and that's because we've done a lot of climate change modeling, which shows us that that will be the case. And I think in a way that helps us because we have a clear anchor point in terms of the policy that we put in place is a necessity, it's not a luxury. And now a lot of the work that we're doing is looking at analysing the implications of that transition and what it means for different sectors, the contribution of different sectors, the distribution of impacts, etc. So that's where we're working. So of course we, as the Commission, we invest in many different areas of analysis in terms of scenarios. We do a lot of investment in the modelling, integrated assessment models that are used, for example, by the IPCC, which help set our policy framework, but also the policy framework for everybody else around the globe. And it's very important in terms of getting consensus on the level of ambition and the types of action in terms of implementation. We're doing a lot of work also, of course, all other policies, for example, the Fit for 55 policies, but also the target for 2030, the long-term strategy also rely on a suite of models, and we do a wide range of modelling comparison exercises. But what we're trying to do is develop, yes, again, you do use baselines, which are moving over time and moving quite fast, and we don't always have time to update the baselines in the way we would like. But we try to have a consistent baseline, and we use scenarios which refer to a common baseline across all the policy measures, so that we at least show a direction of travel and the order of magnitudes of possible impacts. So yes, it's very important. I think also one issue I want to come back to in terms of the transition. One thing which, I'd say, on one level is very disturbing, but at the same time is also in a way reassuring about the fact that the transition will happen, is that unfortunately climate change will keep leading to impacts. We're seeing impacts now, they will get more extreme. And one thing we know for certain from the IPCC's work is that we need to reduce emissions substantially now. We need to take ambitious action before 2030. We can't delay, because the more we delay, the more we overshoot the 1.5 degrees and have to come back again. It means far more ambitious action later, which is going to be harder in terms of the challenge. So we need it helps us to have a smoother transition, but also the impacts of not doing so, not only in other parts of the world where people are more vulnerable and less able to react, but also in Europe. We're also very vulnerable ourselves, as we've seen, last year in Belgium and Germany with the floods. But I mean, already now we also have forest fires already in France. The impacts of those on people's lives, but also on the economy in terms of the impact of lost productive capacity, the impact on public finances as governments become the insurer of last resort. I think that there's some really big questions there, and unfortunately there will be regular reminders, and I think that I hope will help maintain the path of transition. I hope that we just keep up with a smoother path and not have to do things in an emergency situation.
Christian, what's your reaction to that? As a reminder, you published the book Le climat après la fin du mois. So how do you translate this in English? And would you say on that base that maybe the population reaction to policy making is maybe the biggest point of uncertainty?
Of course it is. Well, it's an anxiety problem. We know we have free riding problem here. Everybody wants to solve the problem, but is pointing to other people actions. It's not me, it's you, it's not consumer, it's producer, not producer, it's bankers, and so on. It's not US, it's China. So remember, we know that we have a climate change problem at least since 1992. I take that here because it's the Rio conference where I think politicians recognize the problem. And today we are emitting 36 gigaton of CO2 per year, whereas at that time we emitted 22. So we increased emission by 50% rather than reducing it. So yeah, definitely it's a problem. I would like to come back to, I mean, it's interesting that Matthias and we pointed to the same problem, that is politicians are also there to provide some kind of certainty. Vicky was also mentioning that. It's also true that politicians were helped on climate change and on COVID-19 by experts that also convey the idea that they had the truth, that their model provided the right model to predict what will happen if you do this and that. It's clear in climate change over the last 30 years, I don't know many models where risk is introduced into the model. What Nordos for a lot of time did is he has a model with no uncertainty, but then he Monte Carlo tests with different sets of parameters, and he provides some picture of the uncertainty we face. But we know this is not the right way to do that. On COVID-19, I remember I wrote on SIR models with an economic module to try to estimate the economic cost of the lockdown or different social distancing policies. All those models in March 2020 had no uncertainty in the models. That is, although the uncertainty was enormous on the degree of the remember the R0, you know, this contagiousness. On the mortality of the virus, we didn't know almost anything. No, we know nothing. Although experts provided recommendation to the politician, assuming that there were no uncertainty, just plugging numbers for those parameters from the hat. It's a problem. It's a problem for climate change. It's a problem for COVID-19. We need, I mean, as economists, as decision makers, as decision theorists, we should try to convey the information to the policy makers that we are not sure. And here I think of what Itzhaki said yesterday. We are not sure. We don't know what is the true models. We don't know the parameters to plug in the calibration exercise. But here is the best estimate. But keep in mind, we are not so sure.
Thank you. Matthias, I would like to talk about another crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, which led to some stronger banking supervision and stronger banking regulation. And you've been working on these topics. After this banking supervision has been reinforced, since then there has been no new financial crisis. Do you think that it was efficient and that uncertainty had been dealt with properly at that time when you built those banking supervision new rules?
Well, I think, yes, of course, it has improved. It's better because it was a disaster before. I think the crisis came after years of over-optimism about the resilience of the financial markets, with very little capital in it, no real regulation of liquidity, and so the system was working on very few buffers and with macro imbalances. It's when you have macro imbalances that crisis starts. So, in particular, of course, the housing market in the US. There was also because Gilles mentioned the fact that it's hard today to make predictions because of the uncertainty about policy. The financial crisis was basically started in the context, well, in a weak system, but it was triggered by an unanticipated change in policy. All of a sudden, and that was Lehman Brothers, September 15, 2008. All of a sudden, the authorities decided to basically implement the law, which is to say that if deposits are not insured, well, you don't bail them out. And so, indeed, in Lehman Brothers, nobody was insured because it was not a bank, it was not FDIC type institution, and therefore, indeed, people had losses, depositors, and then all of a sudden, in other banks, these depositors thought, you know, am I next? And boom, and then there is this problem of, I guess, what game theorists call strategic complementarities or herd behavior. All of a sudden, if indeed everybody runs to the bank and you risk not being insured, you want to run also. And now that happens a lot in stock markets. When everybody is selling, you want to sell and so on. But the good news about stock market is that the people who own the stocks may lose money, but it's not money coming out of the companies. While in banks, it's money coming out of the bank, and then bank can collapse and so on. And so basically, immediately, everybody said, oops, I won't do it again. And so bailouts were massive in the end, not of shareholders, but of debt holders, including subordinate and so on. But then people thought, okay, what we need to do is to make the system more resilient, so prevent potential crisis, so with more capital, better liquidity, macroprudential regulation, all that. And so far, it has been pretty resilient. And the shocks have been serious, so COVID, now Ukraine and so on. So, but there are still unsolved issues, like what if we really have to resolve a bank and Europe pretends it wants to limit bailouts and all that, there's Recovery and Resolution Directive. It hasn't been tested yet because one has done everything possible not to have it tested, including finding loopholes and the like. So that is not solved yet, but overall the system is in better shape. But there are potential clouds on the horizon. The competition from fintech, big tech, all these kinds of things. Well, there was this whole problem of the zero lower bound and the reduction in the interest margin and so on due to low interest rates. But banks often can get in trouble when interest rates go up because like in the late 70s, early 80s, in order to stop inflation, there was this huge increase in short-term interest rates. And all of a sudden, the whole savings and loan sector, so the savings banks in the US was basically in big trouble. And it took billions and billions of bailouts and so on. And that was a small sector. While then there was also Japan, for example, that had this huge crisis in the 90s that basically killed growth in Japan for decades. So banks are always, you know, they provide they provide liquidity, so they borrow short and they lend long, and that can be dangerous. And so we should still, but I think the system has been improved a lot. So in that sense, I think that's good.
Thank you, Matthias. So Matthias just underlined, Gilles, that there were lessons that were learned from the 2008 crisis. Is it the same thing for economists and economist forecasting? Because at that time, there was also some criticism about economists sticking too much to models, and which disallowed them to see things, uncertain things, precisely. So do you think that there has been some improvement, or do you think that there is still this model fetishism somehow in the financial world and in the economy more generally?
Honestly, I think a lot of say, private sector economists and public sector economists have been quite humble in the face of the pandemic crisis in 2020, 2021, and now with Ukraine. For instance, we had to innovate in the kind of data we use. I remember the scramble at the beginning of the pandemic for real-time indicators, because the usual indicators we could use, monthly surveys, monthly industrial production numbers, etc., they would come always too late. The frequency was just too low. So there's the famous Google Mobility Index, Apple Mobility Index, and so forth, which really helped us at the beginning, not to predict anything, but at least to gauge the quantum of pain that there was in the system. And it's not because I used to work there a long time ago, but INSEE, for instance, in France, has done a great job at actually being able in real time to provide relatively good estimate of the shock. Now, there's a risk with all this new data and new techniques. So boomer alert, I'm 52, so I'm probably unreconstructed on a number of things. But I like, for instance, also natural language analysis or processing. We like to submit, for instance, speeches by central bankers, this kind of AI techniques. It's quite funny. We actually submitted our own production to this kind of techniques just to see if what we say in our weekly publications have a predictive power over the market. The answer is yes, but it's very, very small, so you're not going to make a lot of money reading us. And then because we know about the observer bias, we stopped using this NPL, because we knew that we would know about the words that would trigger this sort of predictive power. But anyway, because I'm an unreconstructed old-style economist, I still see a risk in this huge quantum of data which has become available, huge computation capacity which has become available, which may make it very, very easy to design what is commonly called blind models. I don't try to infer anything, I don't try to impose any sort of theoretical framework. I just use whatever is available. I'm going to pick the model that provides me with the best fit at this current moment. It's super dangerous because obviously, as you all know, if you estimate 1,000 models, one is going to work, but usually completely by chance. So I still hark for a certain belief in the fact that if you don't come up with a nice theoretical sequencing, a chain of events, a chain of inferences, you may come up with models that work for 3 or 6 months, this model fetishism, and because it looks quantified, it's going to convince a lot of people. But there needs to be a story behind this. I mean, storytelling for me remains central, and this is what economic theory helps us to provide. So yes, we've learned, we use more data, we use new techniques, but you still need to learn your history of economic thought.
Does anybody want to react to that point? Do you share this take on the possible danger of this huge amount of data? Christian, for instance?
It's true that when as I said earlier, dependence on one single model to explain the world is a dead end. In particular, we need, decision maker need to better understand the role of uncertainty in the way they go to a decision. And let me illustrate this with an example, and it's a worldwide example. It's more than an example. Then, France is the only country in the world in which risk is an ingredient in the policy evaluation. So all countries around the world use in the policy evaluation, in particular in public investment, they use a single discount rate to evaluate all their policies. That is, in order to determine whether a public investment is good or bad, they just estimate the flow of expected net benefits of the project, and they discount it using a single discount rate. That is, we assume risk neutrality. we assume pure risk neutrality. And it's based on the old idea developed by Arrow and Lind in a paper in 1970 or 72, I don't remember. And it's I call that the Arrow-Lind fallacy. That states are so big that they can diversify all the risk, and therefore they should behave in a risk-neutral way. So when I hear my colleague presenting complex models where we, on top of risk aversion, we add ambiguity aversion, and we try to estimate a two-stage risk measurement. Let me just try to remind you that the current situation is that almost everywhere in the world, evaluation of risk is non-existent. In most places, determining whether we should invest in school or in a hospital, in a new infrastructure for railways or for highways, they just look at expected benefit and expected cost, and if expected benefit is larger than the expected cost, boom, let's do it. So we still have, my friends, a lot of work to convince that risk matter, in particular in those dimensions that are with big risk, extreme events, climate change, COVID-19. Risks are so important. So just give you an example. You know, this debate in France, we had, and probably in other places in the world, about capacity of ICUs, of intensive care units. Whether in the past, in France, we did not invest enough in those capacities. Clearly, the answer is yes, because investing in ICUs is most useful in the worst state of nature. When we have a pandemic, at the same time we need more we need more ICUs, and at the same time the situation is catastrophic on the economic term. So investing in ICUs is an example of an investment where you get extra benefit from insuring against the worst state of nature, where the benefits are larger, where the economy where purchasing power is reduced a lot. And this is not recognized. So except that in France, indeed, thanks to different people, in particular myself, we convinced the state to introduce a discounting system where we give a bonus to that kind of investment project with an insurance benefit by considering using a smaller discount rate to recognize this benefit. So yeah, we still have, my message here is, my friends, we still have a lot of work to convince that risk and uncertainty is important when we make policy recommendation.
Matthias, you wanted to add something? You were taking lots of notes.
No, I agree that these things are important. I think these are not obvious things to do. I guess we had this discussion a bit yesterday already, but it's like in business, they talk about moving from just in time to just in case. Just in time, the bottom line is to limit buffers as much as possible, because in a world with limited uncertainty, they are just wasted. So, of course, when all of a sudden uncertainty arrives, you feel of course, sorry, but in terms of pandemics, for example, one excuse politicians gave about we don't have a stock of masks or things like that is because previously we were criticized for having bought too many, and also vaccines that were not used and so on. And so, sorry, but we kind of learned our lesson. Well, it was the wrong lesson, but these things will be with us forever, I think. But I think it's true that we should have at least a frank discussion about how much risk we are taking.
Vicky, is it the same in the EU? Do you feel like a risk is underestimated in policy making?
In my field, no. I think no. I think the challenge is. I mean, when we do our analysis, of course, we do risk assessment, but it's probably not the right sort of risk or the right sort of scale. I mean, I think the last few months have indicated that. But well, I mean, they're technical, but I mean, we do try to push more risk assessment, but I think it's very challenging, as you say, to know where exactly we should be focusing. And so we can, I think the sort of work that's happening in the community here is very important for us in terms of how to learn from a wide range of different situations. And this discussion is really interesting for me because I'm drawing on the experience from a much broader area than I would normally look at. But this research is very important, and we need to get much better at feeding it into our decision making. And I think what I can do is invite people to help us and to do more research in these areas. And we have Big Horizon Europe research programs which people should apply to precisely try to introduce some of these decision making techniques into the way we work. And I think we have a lot that we can export from the climate policy debate, because just of the nature of the debate.
Well, thank you for this reaction. We have about 10 minutes left. Are there any questions? Yes, please.
It works like this? Yeah. I want to ask what is done, what can be done about the distrust of science that we see in all the domains that you mentioned. I mean, in my subjective view, someone's completely nuts when I hear about anti-vaxxers who believe that the government implants things in our minds, and I'm talking about people who are, you know, educated, liberal, vote left, and still believe that all this is part of that. And then with climate change, there are, of course, climate deniers, and some of them sound more reasonable. And when it comes to mistrust of economic models, we have some Nobel laureates in economics who are among them. I guess some names are familiar. But my question is, what has been done for the time being? What can be done about it? Because to me, as an outside observer, it seems like something very dangerous that's going on there. I mean, so different sciences with different degrees of certainty in their findings, and I trust the vaccines much more than I trust the macroeconomists. I'm an economist, but I do believe that there's some science behind, and there seems to be some movement that people just are not willing to read, not willing to listen, combination of people on the right and the left. Can more be done about that?
Thank you. Who wants to answer?
Well, this question becomes more and more important and a political issue. In Europe, we don't have such a phenomenon as we see in the US concerning climate change. Clearly, in climate change in the US, you have the proportion of Democrats who believes in the fact that we should do more for climate change is 4 times larger than the proportion among Republicans. In France, we don't see that. There is nothing like, at least for that issue of climate change, we don't see politically oriented or politically motivated bias in belief. Which is probably not true for COVID and the efficiency of vaccine. To tell you the truth, I have no answer. We need to talk with. It's an interdisciplinary issue. We need to talk to anthropologists, to psychologists, political scientists, try to find a solution. I mean, why do we see this loss of this reduced trust in science? It's a critically important question, and it's the future of democracy which is at stake here.
Is there another question? Yes.
Not really a question. I just wanted to bring back on you on what you just said. We don't have this kind of people yet. Because you were saying before, the moment where we will have gasoline that is cheap, but I force you to buy an electric car, people will start having motivated beliefs saying, I don't buy your stuff. I just, this is stupid and I will do what is best for me. So I think we don't have that yet because our style of life is not put into cause yet. And maybe it's not even denial of science. It's just that people are used that science delivers goods that make my life better. And so I believe in science. And then science asks me to do something that is against my interest. And in that case, well, I don't believe in science anymore. And there will always be a political entrepreneur that picks on that and uses that for his own power. So, bit of a sad note, but I think you had to add a yet to our reasoning.
Just a reaction, a quick reaction on this. There is this behind this issue, this concept of rational expectation. We know of a literature with optimal expectation. People bias their belief to feel better or to better justify their way of life and things like that. And we probably have to have a look at that too.
Maybe to come back to vaccines, I think that the vaccine, I mean, I think by now people understand that COVID can be dangerous, but that it kills reasonably few people, and there are now good indication about who is at risk and who is not at risk. So somebody who is in good health and who is young, okay, it's not the end of the world if they're not vaccinated. And what you hear from a lot of people, well, typically these are groups who are less educated, less wealthy, and maybe and have less trust in the government. And so all of a sudden the government comes and tells them, look, you need to get vaccinated because it's good for you. Well, for the first time, the government is telling me they want to do something which is good for me. I think there is that more than necessarily I don't believe science. I think that in a sense, even though of course, the problem is that when the stakes are not that big, then you tend to follow other prejudices or whatever. And so in a sense, it's maybe more of a symptom of a problem with democracy in general. And of course, the connection with the truth and what you want to believe in these kinds of things. I would dig a bit deeper in what's wrong with our societies, and then if we manage to fix that, which is not necessarily easy, I agree, this would also fix, I guess, vaccine hesitancy, I would think.
You want to add a final reaction, Vicky?
No, I in terms of the theory, I can't add much more, but in terms of practice, in terms of speaking to people, addressing people in terms of their own values and how they see themselves belonging. I guess the political question and the split in the US is really a question of where do I belong. Some very practical reactions. I know in Europe we have now the EU Climate Pact, which is very much focusing on climate ambassadors, getting a broader range of people explaining the issue. There's similar initiatives for the IPCC, having people who can present the information, a wider range of people. It's not necessarily coming from a government expert but it could be somebody who comes from your community or your group who's explaining it. Might be one practical, more of a practical way of addressing some of these questions.
Unfortunately, we're going to be out of time. Just one question. Sorry.
Hello. I would actually like to pose my question to Vicky Pollard. Okay, so just a disclaimer, I'm a big supporter of strong and immediate action on climate. So, I like the ambitious plans, etc. But at the end of the day, in democratic countries, the public's support and acceptance is a big deal, right? So I know that Europe has its own legislative body, the parliament, which is supposed to reconcile the executive actions with the preference of the European public. But still, sometimes I feel like these ambitious actions might be not exactly in line with the public's preferences. So my question is, how much awareness is there within the policy making, the EC level, let's say, about potential backlash coming from the public when when they start thinking that these policies are a little bit too ambitious, too much sacrifice is needed? And you already mentioned the climate ambassadors. So how much importance do the
European Commission policymakers put on potentially, investing efforts in really, persuading the public ultimately towards supporting these policies?
So, yes, I think it's at the forefront of our minds all the time. In the sense of in the work we do, we're working more to describe the impacts of our policies better, to look to go to more levels of detail on what it means, not at member state level, at regional level, but also for different types of households, different income groups, and so on. So we work on all of that. So it's also very much politically part of the debate. When the proposals are being debated by the Commission when they make a proposal. So our work goes to a body of commissioners who are appointed by member states, where they will put out, it's very much a consideration, how will this be received? And I think what you see now in Parliament, there's been a very big green vote in the Parliament, and we have a Parliament which acts and is very vocal about the level of ambition and maintaining that pressure to increase the climate ambition. There are also other members of Parliament who often don't have that view, and that's part of the democratic process. I think there's also an element which is less visible in terms of the lobbying. There's a lot of lobbying which is less visible, as in many other countries, and that might also be reflecting the views of organised parts of society. the NGOs who are, or the NGOs are more visible, are more out with the messages. But I think also a lot of the politicians were really concerned about the impacts on vulnerable people, costs of living, how people perceive the transition and the restrictions on their lifestyle. So we do really think a lot about that. And actually the Social Climate Fund is a reaction to that. It's about saying we need an instrument at EU level which ensures that all member states have access to funds to address the needs of the vulnerable. And we get into issues of, how much should we, at the central level, dictate what member states do? The questions of what we call subsidiarity, what is best decided at a European level versus what's best decided at a national level or lower level within member states. But it's very much there. In terms of communication, our DG Communication, I think they have units. You could put 3 units of DG Com together, which are the size of a whole Directorate General for DG Klima. So there's a lot of work on communication. I think, as all institutions, we face the challenges of how best to get the message across, and so. But there is the amount of focus on communication is enormous, and it's at all levels. Yes, we do focus a lot, but. We're still happy to learn from how to do it better.
Well, thank you, Vicky. So unfortunately, time is up. But if you have some more questions, I guess you can ask them directly to our speakers, which I thank very much for their presentations and their interventions and their take on all of these topics. And thank to all of you for your attention. Have a good afternoon and a nice weekend.